What I really want to talk about in this opening address, to just get us, if you like, get the juices firing and get us thinking about what it is as a community we can be talking about, not just today, but from here on in, building partnerships and connections around this theme data ethics and looking at different ways that we can make sure that we're keeping humans in the data. And I'll talk a little more about how I would like to propose that we think about doing that. So we are swimming in data, and that's one reason that we as researchers, as practitioners, as activists are engaging in this, but it's also why in the general public there's this growing concern, if you like, about what is it that happens with the data. And it's not that necessarily it's always about new data. There's a lot of data that has been with us from the beginning. It's just that now we have new ways of capturing and understanding and knowing. And there's more that can get lost and more than that can leak. And those sorts of concerns were what led to the generation of the Human Data Network through the Connected Intelligence Center. When we started having these lunchtime conversations, we've had data drinks. Within the Master of Data Science and Innovation, we've been discussing these issues. And really the three starter questions that I put out to the community to start to get the conversation going are the ones that you have here. Thinking about how we can lift the lid, if you like, on the black boxes that do some amazing work, and sometimes it's nice to have a black box that does it that I don't have to think about, but shouldn't we as humans be capable of lifting those lids? How do we interrogate the data science practices that are starting to shape the way that we're working on these things? And can we still be humanists in the way of engaging with data science practice? Where does ethics come into play? And again, as Glenn had flagged, for us at UTS, there's a really lovely opportunity for us as a university to engage not just with data science practice, but look at the intersection of data science with creative intelligence and social justice, which are three tenets, hallmarks, if you like, of the way that we at UTS are trying to engage as researchers, as educators, and as activists. So what I want to do just to start off is I'll be an academic, and I'm going to give one definition of data ethics, because for myself, what I've found myself transitioning from is this idea of an information ethicist into a data ethicist. And there's one particular definition I just want to put to you at the start. I know it's early in the morning and it's before coffee, but we'll put that there. And then just explore briefly some of the conversations that are going on around this notion of the rise of machines, both as a positive and as a negative. And that sets the scene for something that some of the Master of Data Science students are going to engage you in immediately after my talk, which is a bit of a game to get you thinking about utopias and dystopias and where realities might be somewhere in between. And then getting to this idea of data science practice, data advocacy, and to then close with some provocations for us as a community that I'd like to propose that we think about ways of keeping humans in our data practices, making the invisible visible, and thinking about when we need to and when we can make the invisible visible, and also how we can go about creating truly informed data publics. So this is probably the densest slide. This is where I can be a lecturer, and then after this I'll go on and we'll have conversation. So this idea of data ethics. So Ellen and I have talked about this because when I first started having conversations with Simon and members of the team about what it is that we use as the shorthand for the issues that we're trying to engage with. So when I set up the community, I've used this idea of human-centered data science practice or humans and data. And now increasingly we're starting to see languaged in particularly the academic literature, this notion of data ethics. And so this particular text, which was put out by the Oxford Internet Institute, and it involves Luciano Floridi. So that in itself was a marker for me because Luciano has been an information ethicist and an information philosopher. And to see him starting to language things at the level of data as opposed to the level of analysis and information made me go, okay, so what is his argument? And so I just pulled this little statement out. As I said, it's the densest part, but I thought we're using this term data ethics, what do we mean? And so the reference that he makes to why it is that this level of analysis around data as opposed to information is critical, I think flags exactly the sorts of things that we social informaticists have been talking about for a few decades. And that is this relationship between people, information, and technology as being one that is co-evolving. That is not just about technology, it's not just about people, it's not just hardware and software, it's the interconnections and the interplays. And so when we start to think about data ethics the way that Floridi and Tadeo are defining it, that fits very well. It's this sense that whatever the platform, whatever the technology, it is not just the hardware, as he says what I've highlighted it. It's not the hardware that causes the ethical problems. It is what the hardware does with the software and the data. That being our starting point. And that is the source of some of these new moral dimensions. So this sense of morality comes in as well, which I want to come back to in a moment. So we've talked about this in the black box brown bag, how this rise of machines is not just about data, it's about two co-evolving forces, if you like. The growing capacity of digital technologies to make different ways of doing, collecting, connecting possible, and also the rise of data. So we have three general enablers that are talked about by different sectors of communities that are having conversations around data science and these issues of data ethics. And one is the growth of sensors, so the Internet of Things, the fact that we increasingly are developing cyber physical systems that make data visible. And then we've got growing analytic capacity for actually trying to understand what that data could be telling us. And I'm going to come back to that, what it says as opposed to what it should be saying or what is not being said. And then we've got this growth of communication infrastructure. So the collision of those three enablers, if you like, is what brings us to this moment where people are increasingly starting to say, okay, how do we as humans stay in this conversation? You also hear this notion of datification. Okay, so how many people here are wearing some sort of a Fitbit or a sensor or using something that's tracking, okay? So, and we outsource to things that then tell us what it is that our day is like, okay? Because we as humans, we don't have to remember all that if I had to count all my steps or if I had to know where I've been. So, outsourcing to the machine. These new capacities for not only collecting but then trying to make sense of that, so that intertwining of new AI capacities and data growth are a part of that conversation. And so this notion of datification is something that people are referring to. And I love this story that was in Science earlier in the year about the fact that now new data storage capacity is such that people have started to develop a way of encoding data warehouses in DNA. And so that particular story in Science talked about, imagine a truckload of data just coming to your door or being moved in. So as we start to collect more, we have more that we have to preserve or protect or to be able to access. And as you will hear, in our brilliant argument tonight as Team Machine, there are certain things that machines are just going to be able to do better, right? Even as an information ethicist, I know that. So what this does is lead to a growing concern, not just amongst researchers and activists, but in the general public. You often see reference to the idea of the rise of the machines, and this is still one of my favorite images from a Terminator movie. So this notion of something that is half machine, half human, and where are the controls, where are the stops? And I come back to Luciano Floridi on things that he's been saying for decades about where we are in this InfoSphere as humans moving through the world, where it is always connected to information and cybernetics. We live in an InfoSphere, he says. We exist as information organisms. So as we move through the world, we give off information, we are collecting information. And as he argued back in 2007, if you are spending more time connected than sleeping, you are an info-org. So hands up, how many people spend more time connected than sleeping? Okay, well, I was worried if there were going to be, I suppose if we had more undergraduate students, there'd be more sleeping than connecting, I'm not sure. So it's for the most part, and increasingly now people sleep and are connected at the same time. So there are these growing concerns about what's happening to our bodies. So we are info-orgs, so we're in this InfoSphere. And now increasingly people talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and it's very much a part of our present and our future. And there are growing concerns about the fact that AI is now starting to be able to be taught right from wrong. So that begs the question, who is doing the teaching? And what are those moralities? What are those concerns? There's also opportunities. There's really interesting possibilities in the ways that some of these tools can be used. So this particular story that came out earlier in the year was following a high school student who was, he had spare time before he started at Stanford. And he had a couple parking fines. And so he did what any, I'm looking at Tom in the back row, I'm sure you've played with these sorts of ideas. You go, I've got some time on my hands, let me see what I can do with the tool to try to work out how I can beat this fine. And so he created a chatbot that helped himself, and then he worked out a way to start to help others. He offered this for free, started making great inroads, training himself and developing a real professional capacity around working with AI. And then he made the decision to turn his talent towards trying to address homelessness. So again, it's lovely to see the different ways that some of these technologies and the people who develop capacity with these technologies then do what I like to think of as using these for forces of good. So we have those choices. Now, AI is in our future, but this idea of thinking machines and automation has been with us as a species for a long time. And I love this quote from Pamela McCorduck, that artificial intelligence began with an ancient wish to forge the gods. And these are two lovely early illustrations of ways that we as humans try to imagine machines that could be us, be like us, but not us. So something that could extend the things that we as people wanted to do. So in Greek mythology, you have the idea of the Talos automaton that circles around the island and can be there to protect. So it's a way of automating something for, could be for the forces of good, unless you are on the wrong side of that automaton. And then Al-Jazari, an engineer, now rising in prominence in terms of historical revisitations of some of the early work in Islamic mathematics. And I think that there's some beautiful illustrations of different kinds of automatons that are doing hand washing or playing musical instruments and doing things that are more mechanistic, that you can just imagine coming up with ways of trying to enable humans to experience more of the world. And then we have later on a Catalonian poet who also tried to imagine what a thinking machine might look like. And again, what I wanted to point to by having these three examples is this intersection between art and science, this intersection between the aesthetic and the technical. And it is really an aspiration of mine to see that we can carry on conversations to look at ways that we can keep aspiring that way and looking at ways of supporting the human spirit along these lines. And this idea of the bright and dark, the different ways that we as a species have worked with technology, as I said, started almost from time immemorial. And as technology started to develop in the Industrial Revolution, you start to see a ramping up of concerns, the dystopic views, but also the utopic. And in the example of Jules Verne, you can see that both of those can inhabit the same person. So is anyone here familiar with the lost novel, this idea of Paris in the 20th century? So this was a novel, supposedly one of the first ones that Jules Verne wrote, but it was rejected by the publisher because it was considered far too dark and gloomy and far too unrealistic. He was painting a picture of what it would look like to be in Paris in the middle of the 20th century, so he wrote this in the 19th century. And what he starts to describe in that is a person wandering through the streets somewhat disengaged because the technology that is in use separates the human from the community. So it's interesting to think that in the 19th century that was considered far too unrealistic. And you look at it, you go, well, quite future-oriented. And yet at the same time, Jules Verne is also the person who gives us the most beautiful illustrations as part of the world expositions in the late 19th, earliest 20th century, where he defines with excitement imaginings like electricity, and imagine if a room like this had light and we didn't have to have windows. You can just imagine the excitement in those sorts of places. So you get in the spirit of one person, both the bright and the dark. And that continues through alongside the rise of robotics, the rise of technology in the 20th century, you get this tension between humans and machines. So the rise of machines is there. And in film, there's some lovely illustrations. So Metropolis is one of those classic illustrations where we see machines taking over. And then Charlie Chaplin showing, well, yeah, maybe they take over, but let's do a little light, bubbly look at this and just take a comic pause and think about what kind of future we could shape. And then we come to 1945, and one reason I always stop to think about Vannevar Bush is my background as a Sovietologist. So I specialized when I was first an academic in looking at the tensions of the Cold War and looking at the different ways that we, in the West, were trying to understand what was happening in the East. So my early job, which now doesn't exist because it's been replaced by a machine, was to try to understand all the data that could be extracted from the Soviet Union to try to paint a picture of what was happening behind the Iron Curtain. So 1945, the beginning of the atomic age, parallels the rise of the computational age, new computational intelligence. And when I read this essay by Vannevar Bush, I always imagine someone sitting in a room having experienced a world where an atom bomb has gone off. And we try to think about what we as a species could do to prevent this from happening again. And when I look at various passages in that essay, one of the aspirations he has is there's just too much information out there that we as individuals and as trained specialists in our domains cannot make sense of fast enough to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. Surely, with computational capacity, it behooves us to, or I was told so, English is not my first language, I sometimes pronounce it wrong. I think I heard the other day it's behoves and not behooves. So. But it's important for us to look at the different ways of trying to take advantage of computational capacity to understand ways of solving the world's problems. But earlier in the piece, and so that part 5 section in Vannevar Bush's essay is often invoked as the argument for why it is that we just need to pass everything to machines, why it is that computational intelligence is so important. It was one of the essays that supposedly led to the imaginings of hypertext. So Vannevar Bush created these confections, the memex. He came up with different ways of working with computers to manage information and large-scale information. But earlier in that essay, there's this lovely piece, which I quite like, where he points to the fact that there are still things that humans do better, that for mature thought, there is no mechanical substitute. And in other parts, he starts to talk, what I hear when I read that, is someone who recognizes the need for us to harness our creative capacity and find ways to support human thought and allow us to be human. The other reason I like that Vannevar Bush piece is because now increasingly in these conversations about AI, this idea of the arms race comes up. Is the battle with AI now the next arms race? So are we, as a species, facing extinction? Is artificial intelligence going to be the end of humanity, or will it save us? And this is where now increasingly in various domains, in disciplines and organizations, communities internationally and within Australia, you start to see communities coming together to think about the policies, the guidelines, the codes that they can write to try to manage this inevitable force. And that's some of what we're going to be talking about today, the conversations that we have with people from industry that are coming in to share it. It's the kinds of conversations I want us as a community to continue to have. They're the sorts of things that aren't just being discussed by professionals. These are conversations that are moving ever deeper into the general public. So, I can remember early on when we were first developing the Master of Data Science and Innovation, and Simon and I would talk about algorithmic accountability, and if you searched the hashtag algorithmic accountability, you found very few. And now, there are so many variations on that, and we've moved into even richer conversations around that, and that's not that long. These issues of transparency, opacity, accountability, justice, social justice, making sure that people aren't left behind, these are the sorts of conversations that are really critical for us as a community to come together and talk about. And they're the sorts of things that are starting to be discussed in ever increasing frequency. This idea that algorithm politics, so that algorithms can now shape politics, and that could be a threat to democracy if we don't put some sort of control on it. Thinking about how to tame tools so that they function in our best interests. And a very an oft-cited piece was in ProPublica earlier in the year about the different ways that machines can actually embed bias and perpetuate bias. It's the sort of conversation that is now increasingly being had in Australia as well. So Genevieve Bell has returned to Australia after years working with companies in the United States and engaging with this human technical intertwining to set up an institute to start to build more accountabilities and to engage in that. Alan Bloom, who you'll hear from if you're joining us, hopefully you stay for the debate and come in the evening, or wave your hand and you can meet her in the coffees or the teas and have conversations, has been talking about these things now that she's returned to Australia as well. And what this reminds us of is the fact that algorithms are human. So they are designed at the moment still by humans. We haven't quite reached the idea of the singularity. So we have the capacity to think about how to shape these. So this story I found really amazing when I came across it earlier in the year. This is a specialist, this is a woman with great machine learning capacity who was building a robot and understood how to build robots and suddenly found that her own robot was misbehaving. And when she looked at it, she worked out that the code that was used for facial recognition was not recognizing her skin because she had dark skin. And she did what exactly anyone would do. Instead of building code from scratch, you use what's available. You think, well, facial recognition, great, I'll use it. It exists. I don't have to start from the very beginning. So then unpacking that to realize how deep those assumptions and those preconceptions went. So what is used to train will then perpetuate certain assumptions and expectations. And so this statement that computers don't become biased on their own, they learn that from us. Now, we can't go back, we can only go forward. So we as a community have an opportunity to start thinking about ways that we can shape that training. And this is where I'll come back to Floridi and Tadeo and the work that they've been trying to do around naming this idea of data ethics and thinking about codes of practice. And it's the sort of thing that we try to do with the data science students that we're working with in MDSI. It's the sort of thing that increasingly is done nationally and internationally with various communities of data scientists and coders to think about all the different ways that we can become more aware of the opportunities for morally good solutions. Now, that's still very, very loaded. The fact that it's up there, that's great, but what constitutes morality and whose morality? These are still the questions to have. But to begin with, what I propose, what we try to do in MDSI, for instance, is lift the lid on those black boxes and start trying to find the invisible work that goes into designing and building and perpetuating the use of these tools. So thinking about the different ways of creating opportunities to, in the word of the training, in social informatics, we talk about articulation work. So you're looking at the work that is needed to get work done. So let's think about the different ways that the tools and the coding that is used that we pick up pre-packaged. It's like the provenance work that you do when you're trying to think about where your food comes from. So let's think about where our data comes from and where the tools that are managing and holding and housing and processing our data are coming from. So this is how we try to harness data's human value within MDSI. We start with this wonderful statement that is still one of my favorites from Jeff Bowker, who has worked in infrastructure politics and has dealt with the politics of categorization for a long time. That raw data is an oxymoron, it's also a bad idea. So we try to practice careful cooking. We try to think about the different ways that we can look at the origins of our data and be careful with that. And in our graduate attributes and our course intended learning outcomes, we make this very visible. We think about the different ways that we can not just develop this capacity as students and as educators, but how we take this into our practices. And it would be lovely to imagine this becoming a mantra for us as a university community, to think about the different ways of embracing our ethical responsibilities, to think about the different ways of making the invisible visible. That, for me, is a particularly critical one right now. I think there are so many places where data is held up as providing evidence, and there's little opportunity unless we grab it to say, who is in there, who is not in there? Why are they not in there? What is not represented there, and why is that not represented? What is underrepresented? What is misrepresented? So we have to develop that capacity to speak, to be the voice for people who are initially not with voice in those conversations. And that's how we as a community lead data science and take a leadership role in this and offer pathways, not just for professionals, but for communities. So that brings me to this idea of data advocacy as well. So it isn't just about training our students, it's not just about developing good practices as researchers and practitioners. It's about thinking about the different ways that we can be a voice for data advocacy and for better education and better data literacies within the community. So going back to that idea of this fear of the rise of machines, one reason that exists is because a lot of people feel disenfranchised and disconnected and without power in an increasingly datafied world where it feels like you have to have expertise to know what to do. You go into a bank and they'll tell you who you are. You go, well, I didn't think that was me. Okay, how do I speak up against that? There's this beautiful story that Gerald Thorpe tells in this Medium post that he calls Turning Data Around, where he describes a high school in New York City that was identified as the saddest place in Manhattan based on data that had been gathered through an API that a community or a research group far removed from New York had gathered about the city, about Manhattan, and they'd worked out, okay, let's do sentiment analysis. This is a very common technique. And they mapped, and there was this hot spot near Central Park that turned out to be a high school. So then they did what a good researcher might do. They tried to understand what could lead to this possible explanation. And what they found was that the date when they had collected that data coincided with the return of students to the school after a break. Well, that's why they're depressed. You see, they've come back from vacation, okay? Who's not sad when they come back into high school at that? The only problem was that those high school students didn't realize that they were supposed to be sad because they weren't sad and they weren't depressed. And we can just imagine the consequences of telling a high school student that they're supposed to be depressed. So there's a real agency issue there, and there's a responsibility. So what he talks about is, okay, let's think about the ways that we could turn the data around. So often, data flows in one direction. Data comes from us, but it rarely returns to us. So what would happen if we build into our practices, and we try to do this in MDSI, there's lots of participatory researchers who try to do this as well. Let's think about the ways that we build conversation, build a toing and a froing. Sure, carry on doing great data work. Don't expect everyone to develop that data capacity, but build into your processes the way to turn that data back around and make sure that you are conversing with the people from whom you've taken that data in the first place. Now, that doesn't mean that you can assume that they're going to understand how to make sense of it unless you are starting to train them as well. And the problem is that this slows the process down. Now, I say problem. For me, that's not a problem. I'm a participatory ethnographic researcher. But often people say, well, that's not happening fast enough. Well, what's the point of something happening so fast if it's wrong? And now, increasingly, we have an ethical and a moral responsibility, I think, to think about the ways of creating new ways of working with data. We have a responsibility for making the invisible visible in these cases, because data is given a voice by the people and by the tools that are increasingly being used in this process. We can give it a different voice, but we have to train ourselves, we have to train our data publics, we have to do what Gerald Thorpe calls create real, functioning data publics. Not just paying it lip service, but making the investment in education and in training. Holding data stewards accountable. So can we actually code human values into AI? This is a growing question. Can we create a morally good machine? And for this, I'm going to go back, way back to early conversations around ethics. And I love this idea that comes from Aristotle. And I didn't look at the original language, so apologies if anyone can read the original, so I drew on an English translation. The good of a human being is related to being human. The humans, being human, are not perfect. Humans are subjective. So if all knowledge and every pursuit aims at some good, that question of what we mean by good becomes an important part of the conversation. Who's good? Coming back to the idea of morally good, underpinning the definition of data ethics that Floridi and Tadeo present. Is there one singular good? What is the good for one community as opposed to the good for the other? So again, there's another layer of conversation that we as a community have to have. And this brings me back to some of the work of Jeff Bowker and Susan Lee Starr and Karen Riddler on this idea of infrastructure politics. So in the same way that the old mantra used to be, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, I think it takes an infrastructure to raise and make an AI. It's not just the technology, it's not just the tool, it's not just the training to work out how to design. It's the entire system, the entire process, the village around that development. It's technical, it's human, it's physical, it's social, it's visible, it's invisible. It's not just one infrastructure, it's in fact infrastructures, plural. And so increasingly, the group of data ethicists that I've been having conversations with, we talk about trying to understand the ecology, trying to look at, okay, what is this dynamic ecological space within which this AI is being grown? How can we remain alert to actors who are excluded? Are there particular communities or individuals that are somehow out of the loop on this that we need to deliberately bring in? Can we start to map the infrastructure and map the architecture that is informing the design, the implementation, the use, the evaluation? Can we identify critical choice points, places where maybe we really deliberately need to intervene or need to add evaluation so that we can catch something? Because again, when things are released in the wild, they don't behave as we had intended. And with the best of intentions, we can actually create something that is problematic. So if we identify choice points early enough, we could potentially still release things, evaluate experience, but then also catch something before too much harm is good. So we need to find the humans in the assemblage. We need to think about the different ways that we can bring those intertwinings more to the fore, become more mindful of these co-evolving relationships, foreground the way that knowledge work is actually performed in these data science practices. Because the data is just the starting point. And most people, really, bluntly, aren't really concerned about the data. They're concerned with what the data will enable. They're concerned with the way that the data will help them to get their work done, get from point A to B. It becomes information, it becomes knowledge. It provides insight. So getting that right is really critical. Bringing that background work center stage for us as practitioners, as educators, as advocates, is where I think there's a real critical moment in our time, a critical point in the conversation around these concerns for us as a community and for the general public. It's about holding these algorithms accountable and the designers of these algorithms accountable, asking the difficult questions before too much gets crystallized, before it becomes so institutionalized that you hear, well, we can't do anything about it now. How do we change those models? How do we recognize categorization as a provocation? So this comes back again to this idea of the politics of classification and the politics of categorization. And Simon has written about this in a really nice Medium post, talking about the fact that these data points are just tiny little portholes. So they do not replace a human, they do not replace human experience, they become useful opportunities for insight, but let's not give them more credence than we should. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's think maybe instead of artificial intelligence about the possibility of augmented intelligence, where we are actually harnessing the capacity of the technology and allowing for the delightful notions of humanity to actually be made better use of. Can we think about the different ways that we can allow ourselves to have hunches, to draw on intuition and gut instinct in ways that we often don't have time because we often do not have time to think. We're very often caught up in trying to design and get something out, production. What I would love us to be able to do is to try to think about building a folding and an unfolding of uncertainties into our practices. So I look on the back row to my students from MDSI, we celebrate uncertainty. We talk about the different ways that instead of removing those uncertainties, we can actually build that into our design practice. Can we start to code something, then try to resolve what might be working, what might not be working as well as it should, create this toing and froing. And so the one last thing I want to start to point to is alongside all this data work, alongside working with these new technical tools, the other thing I want us to think about is what it means to be human. And for this, I'm going to come back to a statement from an information ethicist that again, helped to shape my thinking when I was working on my thesis, David Levy, who had worked at Xerox PARC and worked as a high-level designer on some real cutting-edge technologies at the time, and then moved into academic practice, where he suddenly realized that what he imagined the academy to be, an opportunity for thinking, was quite the opposite, because being an academic is a lot of work. It involves a lot of management, it involves a lot of putting together information, and what he found, ironically, was he had little time to think. And so he started to look back at that essay from Vannevar Bush that was referred to as We May Think, and said, well, it's kind of interesting that at this very moment that we, as scholars and as in the general public, you think about the computational tools that allow us to outsource our memory, allow us to gather information from more sources than we could have imagined even 5 years ago. And this statement still exists today. We are losing the time to look and to think at exactly the moment we have produced a remarkable new set of tools. In his case, he was talking scholarly investigation, but we could widen that out to the wider community. So just at that point, we've lost the opportunity to do what humans do best, to be creative, to allow us to ruminate, to be able to understand what our gut is telling us, to be able to think about instinct. So this is where this idea of slow data comes about. And one of the posters that you'll see in the poster session will point to this, because one of our students has been engaging in this activity that is inspired by the work of two information visualizers and data specialists overseas, who have started to ask this question about whether or not we could start drawing by hand, connecting to our humanity, and starting to understand data in different ways. And so Georgia Lupi, who is one of those activists, has started to refer to this as data humanism. And I like that. I love that idea of thinking about ways that we can, alongside developing high-level data science capacities that work with the best of technologies, we can also start to forge better capacities in our human brains and in our human hearts, and think about what it means to be human. How can we celebrate that humanity and start to build better AI-IA partnerships, human-machine partnerships that allow us to be more delightfully human? So for me, the key things that I would love us as a community to aspire to are these 5 statements. Look at the ways to make personal data legible. Think about the different ways to build systems that are far more inclusive. And if they're not inclusive, that we have mechanisms for allowing us to identify ways to make them more inclusive. Can we create better mechanisms for feedback, not just in the design, but in the implementation and the deployment and in the analysis and the evaluation? Can we find ways to make sure we are holding the stewards of data accountable? And alongside that, we must be nurturing better informed data publics, not just ourselves, but the general community. So to close, these are some provocations that I wanted to put out before you start the game, before you start having conversations amongst yourselves and hearing the rest of the really amazing talks that are going to be a part of the day. And I can't thank our participants enough for this, and I thank the Black Box Brown Bag community for starting to engage so passionately in these ideas. This is just the start of hopefully a long set of engagements, not just today, but in the weeks, the months, and I think there'll be enough here for a few years for us to really work with and to keep everybody and ourselves accountable. Can we avoid data determinism to start to make more space for data humanism? Again, it's not an either or. In Boolean terms, it's about combining, the and. Can we become more minded about the assumptions that we're making when we choose particular data sets or particular subsets of that data, and we do so at the expense of others? We always have to make choices. Abstraction is about making choices. It's just about becoming more mindful of the consequences or potential consequences of those choices. And can we start to build opportunities for engaging ongoing dialogue about this, and not thinking that the design process is consultation, development, deployment, end of. We have a responsibility for keeping the communities in the conversation on an ongoing basis, and thinking about the different ways we can bring the providers of that data more actively into the mix. So thank you very much for your attention on this and your engagement with these ideas, and for getting here so early. And I guess that gives us some time for questions and conversation to just before we transition to the game. But thank you for listening.
Theresa, thank you for setting out such a clear set of arguments. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
And you took us through the history and right through the current dilemmas that we face. I am in education, and I'm particularly interested in the role of schools and teachers in all of this. So where do you see that, I guess,
Yeah.
But data increasingly, is for birth, really.
Yeah.
So what's the role of schools and young people of school age in what you're arguing?
Thank you for that question. I think in the same way that a lot of digital capacity and digital literacies are already a part of primary school, data literacies belong there as well. I've talked with school librarians, I've been giving talks in schools about the different ways that we can be playful in the activities that are set up to engage young people in understanding, first off, what it is that they are doing, what their data and their digital practices are, and what the potential consequences are. And in the process, empowering them and educating them to become more aware of the different ways that data is used in research. So you don't have to be a PhD to start to understand that. I mean, we did some work around mobile phone implementations in the New South Wales school system. And part of that process involved building in time to educate our participants, our young learners, in what it meant to interrogate the data that we were collecting about them. And it's really exciting when you watch an 11-year-old who's, hey, anytime you want to give me Coke and pizza, I'm here. And let's talk about what it is you're doing with this data and what could happen. So the challenge is it takes time, and it means that something else has to not be given that time. So usually the difficulty in schools when I've had those conversations with librarians and with teachers, it's, okay, I still have a curriculum to finish. How can I embed this? So, but I think they're such an enthusiastic group to work with. And if there are some that you can think of that you want to involve in taking some of these ideas further, I'd love us to talk about that. That'd be great. Thank you.
This passion of mine, because I think, thank you again for a fabulous expose of
Thank you.
theory. But I'm also really concerned. I went to the Public Benefits Universities conference here on Friday,
Yeah.
and I'm very struck now that, and probably the remark about the schools having no time, this time thing is almost like a technocratic whole outcome. I'm watching, academics as well as students, as well as administrative staff, feeling this data system they can't change. And it's almost like it's containing them into this space where no thinking is possible.
Yeah. Well, see,
so it's the relation between the machine, the design, the data, and then the longer term human outcome, because it's almost like people are losing responsibility.
And I think that's again. Oh yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So I should come over here with the mic. We should have. I thought we were going to have a roaming mic. Let me just pass, because it is a good point about. Oh, there's a mic coming down, so I can say mic. So the observation was about how. This is where I feel like Oprah Winfrey. I'm going to walk up the stage and go, okay. Yeah. Sorry? No, there's no car. Sorry. Under your desk, though. Everyone gets a Fitbit. No.
Okay. Do you want me to?
Yes. So.
Oh dear. Can I? I went to the Public Benefits of University conference.
Is that on? See, look how the technology shapes what's happening.
Yes,
so.
Yes, that's right.
So.
Let's have a look. It's semi-on. Semi-on. Yeah. Semi-on.
So it's too smart for us.
I'll shout. Probably easier. I went to the Public Benefits of University conference here on Friday last week, and I am personally really struck at how in academia and schools, the remark was made because the curriculum must be done, we've sort of built a very data-driven and machine-based structure in which we work, which although it was touted in my personal memory in the 90s to be making administration a lot easier, appears to have in fact changed the way a lot of people are working and thinking in unintended, I'm sure, ways, which leave them no time to think and very contained about what they feel they can do to change anything, even teach well. And politically seems to be leaving us in a society where no one feels the need to take responsibility for anything anymore. In lots of ways, I mean, I'm feeling Canberra at the moment, you know, it's not just the public media or the social media. Yeah. I mean, in my lifetime, all of those politicians would have needed to resign absolutely scandalously for taking so little responsibility about them. You know, it's like they're lost in a mechanism they don't control anymore.
And thank you for the question. And I appreciate you. I really wanted you to be able to have a voice in this, so I would try to practice what I preach and not try to sum that up inaccurately. My response to that would be, so the fuller essay that David Levy wrote that I was referring to, where he talks about no time to think, is part of an argument that he makes about contemplative scholarship as a way to first train ourselves as academics. And a lot of the work I do as a creative practitioner is about finding ways for myself, but also for the people who experience an installation that I produce, to become more aware of opportunities for pauses and for green spaces of the mind. Because I would say we do still have an opportunity to subvert, but we can often lose sight of the fact that we have that power. And that's why I feel there's a data advocacy role, because it is really heart-wrenching to hear someone say, oh, I can't change it. You know, I can't change the system. Sure, yeah. And it is, so it's one reason in our data science program, we've talked about changing our own languaging to not talk data-driven, but data-informed. So that when we ourselves start to think that we are not, I mean, it's lazy to give over to the machine. It takes a lot more work to think about what the machine says and then also make sure that we are harnessing our own cognitive capacities sufficiently. And that takes training, and that's where I think it is an important choice to make in schools, in education, but in our research practices as well, to provide those opportunities for slow thinking. It's been, you know, an argument decades in the making for me. I mean, when I did, so my PhD comes out of information retrieval, and you can imagine how weird it looked when I would talk to information retrievalists. The first time I spoke to software engineers, and they went, seriously? You know, that's what you want me to do? Yeah, but there's a wealth of research and evidence that I will now stand here and talk about, and we can have a long conversation about that. I can point you to things. I think there is an opportunity, but we have to act now, because it is increasingly a situation where, you know, I love the Little Britain phrase, the computer says no, you know? Unless you can spit back and go, well, actually, it's saying no because of this, and it could say yes if you did X. But that, again, takes training, awareness, and really a commitment to activism, to hold people accountable, to hold institutions accountable, for us to recognize that we have an opportunity in a democratic system to be able to have a voice, but it does mean putting your head above the parapet. And again, it is the pressure of time, and it can feel like a juggernaut. But I think I look at this room, I look at the fact that every one of the conversations that we tried to set up early in the year around this drew people in from across different disciplines and different backgrounds. So we just have to keep one another together, and we have to support one another. And, you know, it's like, you know, workers of the world unite, data ethicists of the world unite. So thank you. Yeah, and that's my cue to pass that.
So I'm going to have to hit the pause button on Theresa at that point. Can we thank her once more?
Thank you.